The Federation Archaeological Institute on Proxima Station 7 had, over its 300-year operational history, catalogued approximately 47,000 artifacts from extinct civilizations. They had deciphered dead languages from species that had atomized themselves in nuclear fire. They had reconstructed cultural practices from fossilized remains so old that continental drift had shuffled the evidence across entire planetary hemispheres. They had, on one memorable occasion, figured out the complete theological framework of a civilization that had existed as sentient gas clouds. But these tablets? These absolute nonsense slabs of compressed polymer and ceramic composite sitting in temperature-controlled cases in Laboratory Wing 7. These had defeated every single attempt at translation for 5 straight years, which was, to put it in the technical parlance of xenoarchaeology, absolutely mortifying. The tablets had been discovered on Kepler 442b, a planet in the habitable zone that everyone had been terribly excited about, until they actually landed on it and found nothing but red dust, thin atmosphere, and one massive underground vault, containing exactly 10,000 identical-sized tablets arranged in careful rows. Each tablet measured 30 centimeters by 20 centimeters, made from materials that shouldn't have existed together in stable form according to 7 different species' understanding of chemistry. The symbols etched into their surfaces glowed faintly under certain wavelengths of light, which had initially seemed promising until everyone realized the glow told them absolutely nothing useful. The Valorians, who prided themselves on their analytical capabilities and whose mathematics had literally reshaped galactic understanding of quantum mechanics, had spent 8 months on the tablets. They had employed crystalline logic processors that operated in 17 dimensions simultaneously. They had built algorithmic frameworks that could, theoretically, decode any symbolic system in the known universe. The tablets had looked at these efforts and remained thoroughly, stubbornly incomprehensible. The Thick Thar Collective, a hive-mind species with access to billions of parallel processing biological nodes, had taken their turn next. They had the advantage of being able to hold thousands of competing theories in active consideration simultaneously, testing each against the evidence without the limiting factor of individual cognitive bias. They had examined the tablets for 6 months, during which time their consensus thoughts had grown increasingly frustrated, then confused, then somewhat desperate, and finally just annoyed. The tablets continued being unreadable, with what seemed like deliberate spite. The Meridian Scholastica, an order of monk scholars from a species that had spent the last 12,000 years in contemplative study of literally everything, had approached the problem from philosophical, linguistic, mathematical, and interpretive dance perspectives. Yes, interpretive dance. They had a whole theoretical framework about kinetic meaning-making that had actually proven useful in the past. The tablets had not cared about their dancing even a little bit. After the Meridians had admitted defeat, things had gotten somewhat desperate. The Institute had opened the tablets to examination by anyone with credentials, which had resulted in a parade of specialists from 40 different species, each convinced their particular methodology would crack the code. Cryptographers, xenolinguists, quantum semioticians, pattern recognition specialists, and one memorable fellow who claimed to just have a feeling about these things had all taken their shots. The tablets remained exactly as inscrutable as they had been on day 1. The situation had become something of a galactic embarrassment. Academic papers had been written about the tablets, each more speculative than the last. 3 different religious movements had sprung up, claiming the tablets contained divine revelations in a script that mortals were not meant to understand. A rather expensive documentary series had been produced about the Kepler mystery, which mostly consisted of various experts saying they had no idea what they were looking at while dramatic music played in the background. The Institute's director, a Valorian named Jector, whose crystalline form had developed what could only be described as stress fractures, had taken to avoiding the wing where the tablets were stored. The tablets represented a professional failure so profound that several researchers had actually left the field entirely. One Thukthar subset had broken off from their collective specifically to avoid thinking about the tablets anymore, which was roughly equivalent to a human cutting off their own arm to escape an awkward conversation. So when Jektor received the communication that a human wanted to examine the tablets, the director's response was to emit a light frequency that translated roughly to a prolonged sigh of exhausted resignation. Humans, the galaxy's newest members, who had joined the Federation approximately 8 months ago after finally developing reliable faster-than-light travel. A species that had been, by all reasonable assessments, throwing nuclear weapons at themselves less than 2 centuries ago, who still used combustion engines on significant portions of their homeworld, who had only recently figured out how to keep their artificial intelligence from trying to turn everything into paperclips or whatever the latest computational disaster had been. And now they wanted to look at the tablets that had humbled the greatest minds in 47 species. Jektor's stress fractures deepened. But here was the thing about desperation. It made you consider options that rational thinking would typically discard immediately. The tablets had been sitting in their cases for 5 years, generating nothing but academic frustration and uncomfortable questions at symposiums. What harm could come from letting a human poke at them for a few hours? At minimum, it would demonstrate that the Federation had been thorough in exploring all possible angles, including the extremely unlikely ones. The human arrived on a Tuesday, which was not actually called Tuesday on the station, but the translation matrix rendered it as such, and which seemed somehow appropriate for the mundane nature of what everyone expected to be another failure. Dr. Marcus Chen, the human's credentials claimed, though Jektor had learned that human naming conventions were baffling and inconsistent. Xenoarchaeology specialist with a focus on industrial semiotics, whatever that meant. The human had apparently spent considerable time studying what their species called material culture, which seemed to involve a lot of attention to trash and discarded objects that other species would have ignored entirely. Jektor met Dr. Chen in the observation gallery overlooking Laboratory Wing 7, where the tablets sat in their eternal, mocking silence. The human was tall by their species standards, wearing what appeared to be casual clothing rather than any kind of formal academic attire. This was already slightly concerning. The Meridian Scholastica had worn ceremonial robes for their examination. The Valorians had arrived in formal crystalline arrangements. This human had shown up in what the translation matrix was rendering as comfortable pants and a jacket with several pockets. So, Dr. Chen said, looking through the transparistile at the rows of carefully arranged tablets below. These are the famous impossible tablets. They have resisted all attempts at translation, Jektor confirmed, trying to keep the defensive edge out of the frequency patterns. The finest minds from across the Federation have examined them extensively. Right. I read the literature. Very thorough. Lot of theories about ancient civilizations and divine languages and quantum-encoded information matrices. The human paused. Can I just go down and look at them? This was not the approach that previous researchers had taken. Generally, there were preparations, calibrations of equipment, long explanations of methodology, meditation periods. In the case of the Meridians, the human just wanted to walk up and look at them. The tablets are sensitive artifacts, Jektor began, but Dr. Chen was already heading toward the laboratory entrance with the confidence of someone who had not spent 5 years being professionally humiliated by ancient polymer slabs. The observation gallery filled up quickly. Word had spread through the station that a human was examining the tablets, and scientists from various species had arrived to watch with the sort of anticipatory curiosity usually reserved for witnessing something either historically significant or entertainingly catastrophic. The general consensus seemed to lean toward the latter. Several researchers had brought refreshments. Dr. Chen entered the laboratory, walked directly to the first case containing the tablets, and spent approximately 30 seconds looking at the nearest specimen with the sort of casual attention one might give to a mildly interesting menu. Then the human laughed. It was not a polite laugh, or a confused laugh, or any of the numerous types of laughs that might be appropriate when examining humanity's best shot at contributing to a major archaeological mystery. It was the kind of laugh that suggested genuine, delighted amusement at something unexpectedly absurd. "Oh no," Dr. Chen said, still laughing. "Oh, this is embarrassing." In the observation gallery, Jector's stress fractures propagated to new and concerning locations in the crystalline structure. "These aren't ancient alien artifacts," the human continued, moving from case to case with increasing speed, examining tablets with what could only be described as recognition. "These are warning labels. From Earth. These are our warnings." The silence that followed this declaration was so profound that the station's atmospheric recyclers seemed loud by comparison. "Your warnings," Jector repeated, the translation matrix struggling slightly with the flatness of the disbelief. "Yeah. Look, Doctor." Chen pointed to a symbol on the nearest tablet, a triangle containing a simplified figure that appeared to be recoiling from radiating lines. "That's the international symbol for ionizing radiation. Has been since the 20th century. And this one, pointing to another tablet with a skull symbol, that's chemical toxicity. This one's biohazard. That one's electrical danger. These are safety warnings for hazardous materials." The observation gallery had gone from silent to a sort of humming confusion as translation matrices across multiple species tried to process what they were hearing. "That is not possible," said a Cather researcher who had been part of the original collective analysis. "We analyzed the symbol structures for months. The patterns do not match any known linguistic framework." "Well, no, they wouldn't," Dr. Chen said, now examining tablets with the brisk efficiency of someone cataloging familiar objects. "They're not language. They're pictographic warning systems designed to be as universally understandable as possible. We developed them specifically because written language changes too much over time. These are meant to say danger to anyone, even if they don't speak the language or live in the same cultural context." "But the materials," Jector interjected, clinging to some shred of the mystery that had consumed 5 years. "The composite structure should not be stable according to known chemistry." "Oh, that's because it's containment material. We developed it for long-term storage of waste that stays dangerous for thousands of years. The polymer ceramic matrix is designed to remain intact and legible basically forever, even in hostile environments. I think this particular formulation was developed around 2150 or so, when we really started taking the long-term storage problem seriously." Dr. Chen said this with the casual air of someone discussing a historical footnote, apparently not noticing that every researcher in the observation gallery was experiencing their own species' equivalent of an existential crisis. "Let me get this straight," said a Meridian scholar whose contemplative calm had evaporated entirely. "We have spent 5 years analyzing these artifacts. We have written papers, dissertations, 3 religions have formed. And you are telling us this is a waste disposal site? I mean, technically, it's a hazardous materials long-term storage facility," Dr. Chen corrected. "But yeah, basically you found humanity's trash dump." "Well, one of them. We've got a few scattered around this region of space." The magnitude of this revelation required a moment to fully process. The Federation's greatest scientific minds had spent half a decade being defeated by the equivalent of a wet floor sign. The site was dated to being at least 12,000 years old, Jector said weakly. Stress fractures now spider webbing across the full crystalline surface. "Oh, the vault structure, sure. We built these sites to last. The whole point was that we needed storage that would remain stable and clearly marked for way longer than our civilizations might exist. Some of the waste we were dealing with has a half-life measured in tens of thousands of years. You can't just bury that stuff and hope people remember where it is. Civilizations fall, languages change. But basic symbolic warning systems and really sturdy vaults, those persist." Dr. Chen had now moved to examining the vault structure itself, which the Institute had carefully documented and analyzed for years, looking for clues about the civilization that built it. The human was tapping on support structures with the unself-conscious ease of someone checking their own handiwork. "This is good construction," the human noted approvingly. "Very solid. The redundant sealing mechanisms are nice. and the warning tablets, arranged at regular intervals. That's standard protocol. You want anyone who stumbles on this place to immediately understand: do not dig here, bad things are buried here. Leave now. But why? Asked a Valorian researcher with quantum computational capabilities that should have prevented this level of confusion. Why would you dispose of hazardous materials 1,200 light-years from your homeworld? Because that's the point. You don't want this stuff anywhere near populated space. We went through a whole phase in the 21st and 22nd centuries where we were burying waste on Earth, and then going, oh no, we forgot where we put it, or oh no, the geological stability changed, or oh no, people built houses on top of the waste site. So when we developed Reliable FTL, one of the first things we did was find geologically stable, uninhabited worlds, way out in the middle of nowhere, and built proper long-term storage facilities. This is like basic waste management. You find somewhere nothing lives, make sure nothing is going to live there for the foreseeable future, and put your dangerous garbage there with very clear labels. The human said this as though it were the most obvious thing in the universe, which from a certain perspective it probably was, but which from the perspective of 47 species who had spent collective millennia examining the tablets was absolutely devastating. How many of these sites are there? Jector asked, already dreading the answer. Oh, dozens? Maybe hundreds? I'd have to check the records. We really went hard on the distributed storage model. Didn't want all our dangerous material in one place, you know? That's just asking for a catastrophic failure at some point. Better to spread it out across multiple sites in different systems. Somewhere in the way, observation gallery, a researcher dropped their refreshment container. So, what you are telling us, the Thukthar Collective said slowly, is that across explored space, there may be hundreds of sites that we might discover and analyze, thinking we have found ancient alien civilizations, when actually we have found your trash. I mean, when you put it like that it sounds bad, Dr. Chen said. But yes, essentially. Though to be fair, these sites are very well documented. We kept careful records of where everything was placed. It's all in the Hazardous Materials Archive back on Earth. You could have just asked us. We did not know to ask, Jector said, and the translation matrix rendered the crystalline frequencies as what could only be described as a scream. The human had the decency to look somewhat apologetic. Right, yeah, I guess you wouldn't necessarily lead with "Hey, new species, did you happen to find any of our garbage dumps that we scattered across the galaxy 200 years ago? That's a pretty specific question. The implications were cascading now, each one more devastating than the last. Dr. Chen, apparently not noticing, or perhaps simply immune to the mounting existential horror in the observation gallery, had pulled out a portable computing device and was cross-referencing something. Okay, so according to the coordinates and the specific tablet designs, this is storage site Gamma 47, established in 2156. Primary contents are radioactive waste from decommissioned fusion reactors, along with some biological research materials that were too dangerous to keep on Earth after the Geneva Protocols were updated. There's also apparently some chemical weapons precursors that got banned under the Treaty of Luna. Lot of stuff from the period when we were figuring out what should and should not be allowed to exist near populated areas. This vault contains weapons materials. Asked a security specialist from a species that had very strong opinions about weapons materials. Former weapons materials. All neutralized and stored safely, which is why they're here and not on Earth. We cleaned up our act considerably in the 22nd century. Whole lot of wow, we should really not have this stuff just lying around where something could go wrong realizations. Hence the storage sites. Dr. Chen continued scrolling through the information with the casual air of someone reading a shopping list, apparently not registering that every new piece of information was compounding the professional trauma of everyone watching. How long? Zector asked with the careful tone of someone who suspected they would not like the answer. How long has humanity had faster-than-light capability? Reliable FTL. About 250 years. We had some experimental drives before that. But they kept doing this thing where they worked but then sometimes didn't work, and the sometimes not working part was usually catastrophic. So we spent a while figuring out the reliability issues before we really started using it for anything important. You have had FTL for 250 years. Well, yeah. How else would we have gotten the waste disposal sites out here? You can't exactly move hazardous materials at sublight speeds. Takes too long. Too much risk of something going wrong during transit. Much better to jump it out to predetermined safe sites. The observation gallery was processing this information with varying levels of success. The Meridians had entered a group meditation pose that suggested they were contemplating the nature of humility. The Valorians were recalculating approximately everything they thought they knew about human technological development. The Fkether collective had partitioned off several subgroups just to handle the cognitive dissonance. But when humanity applied for Federation membership, a diplomatic specialist said, "Your documentation indicated you had only recently achieved FTL capability." Oh, we had. Only recently achieved stable, safe, commercial-grade FTL, Dr. Chen clarified. The kind you can use for general transportation and trade, and not just for specialized applications like hazmat disposal. The early drives were functional, but not exactly passenger-friendly. Lot of radiation, some minor temporal instabilities, occasional problems with matter coherence. Fine for shipping sealed containers of waste, not great for living beings who prefer to arrive at their destination with all their molecules in the original configuration. So you developed FTL technology specifically to throw your garbage across the galaxy, Zektor said. Among other reasons, yes. Also for deep space exploration, research stations, that sort of thing. But the waste management application was definitely a major driver. We had a lot of hazardous material, and nowhere to put it that wouldn't potentially cause problems for future generations. FTL solved that problem pretty neatly. The humans seemed genuinely enthusiastic about this point, as though efficient garbage disposal were an achievement to be celebrated rather than a revelation that had just destroyed 5 years of academic work and several religious movements. The religious movements, said a Meridian scholar who had suddenly remembered an important detail. There were 3 religious movements based on these tablets. Oh no, Dr. Chen said. The Church of the Sacred Cipher believed the tablets contained enlightenment in a form that transcended conventional understanding. They have monasteries on 4 worlds. Oh no. The seekers of the hidden truth believed the symbols represented a test from ancient precursor species, and that understanding them would elevate civilization to a higher state of being. They have been meditating on the tablets for 3 years. This is bad. And the Kepler revelationists believed the tablets were divine scripture from beings beyond our dimension. They have converted approximately 40 million followers across 12 species. Dr. Chen put their face in their hands. So what you're telling me is that millions of people have based their religious and philosophical worldview on what is essentially a very elaborate, do not dig here sign. Several of their head and temples. The Meridian continued with the inexorable quality of someone sharing information that just kept getting worse, are built around individual tablets that they managed to acquire through legal channels. They consider them holy relics. Holy relics. One prominent temple on Valos Prime has built their entire architectural design around what they call the symbol of transcendent warning. The Meridian consulted a datapad. According to your classification system, it appears to be a no-smoking sign. The sound that came from Dr. Chen was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. They built a temple around a no-smoking sign. It is a very large temple. The symbol is 30 meters tall and rendered in crystallized precious metals. Of course it is. The full scope of the situation was settling over the room like a heavy blanket made of embarrassment and shattered academic careers. 5 years. Hundreds of researchers, thousands of hours of analysis, millions of followers, 3 religions, 17 academic papers, 1 very expensive documentary series. All defeated by the galactic equivalent of caution, wet floor. I feel, Jektor said carefully, that we should discuss what happens next. I mean, I need to file a report, Dr. Chen said. This is technically a safety issue. These sites are supposed to be documented and monitored. The fact that one of them was discovered and nobody recognized what it was suggests we might need to update our galactic hazmat protocols now that we're part of the Federation. Can't have people accidentally building temples on toxic waste sites. That's a liability issue. The human was already typing into their device, apparently composing the report in real time, with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who had not just destroyed half a decade of work and multiple religious movements. There will be academic consequences, a Valorian researcher said quietly. Papers will need to be retracted. Reputations have been built on theories about these tablets. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Doctor, Chen said, and seemed to genuinely mean it. If it helps, the symbols really are designed to be difficult to interpret if you're approaching them as language or encoded information. They're meant to trigger an instinctive danger response rather than communicate specific information. It's actually a pretty sophisticated semiotic system. There were whole committees dedicated to designing symbols that would read as threat to any hypothetical intelligence, whether human or alien, without relying on cultural context or linguistic knowledge. That's why they don't match linguistic patterns, the Cather Collective said, realization dawning. They're not meant to be read. They're meant to be felt. Exactly. The triangle shapes, the color contrasts, the proportions. It's all designed to trigger alertness and caution. We tested them extensively on different populations, even on animals, to see if non-human intelligences would recognize them as warnings. The goal was to create something that would still be readable as dangerous 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 years in the future. Even if human civilization had completely collapsed and all linguistic records were lost. You designed them to outlast your civilization, Jector said. Well, we didn't want to be irresponsible. The waste lasts for thousands of years. The warnings had to last at least as long. It would be pretty terrible to leave behind a bunch of hazardous material sites with no indication that they were dangerous. Future civilizations deserved better than that. There was something almost admirable about it, viewed from a certain angle. Humanity had looked at their capacity to create dangerous things, acknowledged they couldn't unmake those dangers, and settled for making absolutely certain that anyone who encountered those dangers would know to stay away. They had put more effort into warning future civilizations about their mistakes than most species put into avoiding the mistakes in the first place. Of course, they had also apparently thrown their garbage 1,200 light-years into space, rather than deal with it locally, which suggested certain priorities about environmental management, but at least they had labeled it clearly. What about the other sites? Asked a researcher who was clearly already dreading the answer. You mentioned there were dozens, possibly hundreds. Oh yeah. They're all properly documented. I can provide the coordinates if that helps. Some of them are probably in Federation space by now, given how territories have expanded. You've likely stumbled on a few without realizing what they were. This triggered a sudden flurry of activity as researchers began cross-referencing mysterious archaeological sites with the possibility that they might be hazmat storage facilities. Several people left the observation gallery in a hurry, presumably to check on their own research projects with growing concern. The site on Kepler 442b isn't actually that interesting compared to some of the others, Dr. Chen continued, apparently not noticing or perhaps not caring about the minor panic spreading through the room. It's just reactor waste and some biological samples. There's one site out in the Sagittarius arm that has some really fascinating materials. Experimental nanotechnology that kept trying to self-replicate in problematic ways. Some AI core systems that developed concerning behavioral patterns, a few prototype weapons that violated about 17 different treaties. That's the stuff that's really interesting from a historical perspective. You have a storage site full of self-replicating nanotechnology and rogue AI systems, someone said faintly. It's all safely contained and deactivated. That's why it's in storage. We solved the problems. We just couldn't unmake the materials, so they got archived. Very carefully archived, with a lot of warnings. Like, that site has the warnings in multiple formats, including some holographic projection systems that are still running after 200 years. We really did not want anyone accidentally opening that particular vault. The implications were stacking up like a very concerning tower of increasingly alarming revelations. Humanity had developed AI systems with concerning behavioral patterns, solved those problems, and then packed the remains into a vault somewhere in deep space. They had created self-replicating nanotechnology, stopped it from replicating, and archived it for posterity. They had built prototype weapons so problematic that multiple treaties had been written specifically to ban them, and rather than destroying the weapons, they had stored them in carefully labeled containers on uninhabited worlds. And they had done all of this 200 years ago, during what they apparently considered their less technologically advanced period. What? Zektor asked very carefully. What do you do with your hazardous materials now? Dr. Chen looked up from their device. Oh, we've got much better systems now. Molecular deconstruction technology, quantum-level waste processing, that sort of thing. We can actually break down most hazardous materials into component atoms now and recycle them safely. The storage sites are mostly just legacy infrastructure at this point. We still maintain them, obviously, because you don't abandon toxic waste sites, but we haven't needed to create new ones in about 50 years. You can deconstruct matter at the molecular level. Well, yeah. It's not that complicated once you figure out the quantum mechanics. The Valorians must have similar technology, right? Given your advanced computational systems. The Valorian researcher in question made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as sort of, but we thought humans were primitive, so this is extremely concerning. Dr. Chen's communication device chimed. Okay, I've filed the report and flagged this site in the Hazmat archive system. The automated monitoring systems should start including it in regular checkups now. We'll want to verify the containment integrity hasn't degraded. Update the warning systems to include Federation standard symbols alongside the old Earth ones. Maybe add some translation matrices so the labels are clearer. Standard protocol. Standard protocol. Zektor repeated. Yeah. For discovered legacy sites. We have a whole department that handles this. They're actually going to be excited that one of the sites got found. There's been this ongoing project to locate all the old storage facilities and make sure they're still properly maintained. You've probably saved them years of survey work. The humans seemed pleased about this, as though the Institute had done humanity a favor by discovering their hazardous waste storage facility, rather than the other way around where humanity had accidentally humiliated the finest minds in the Federation. I should probably also mention, Dr. Chen continued, that if you do encounter any more of these sites, you should definitely not open the containment vessels. The external warnings are safe to examine, obviously, but the actual storage containers are not meant to be accessed without proper safety equipment. Some of this stuff is pretty dangerous, even in contained form. We have been examining these tablets with standard archaeological protocols for 5 years, said a researcher who was clearly experiencing several realizations at once, none of them pleasant. Oh, the tablets are fine. They're just warning labels. It's what's below them that you want to avoid. This particular site has about 40 meters of vault structure beneath the tablet level, with the actual hazardous materials stored in sealed containment at the bottom. As long as nobody started digging, you were perfectly safe. And if someone had started digging, then you would have encountered the secondary warning systems, which are more explicit about the whole serious danger below this point thing. And if you ignored those, you would have hit the tertiary containment barriers, which are designed to resist pretty much any attempt to break them. And if somehow you got through those, the materials themselves are in individual sealed containers designed to prevent any leakage or exposure. It's all very thoroughly engineered. Dr. Chen said this with the confidence of someone describing a well-designed system, rather than someone explaining how close the Federation's greatest minds had come to potentially exposing themselves to hazardous materials for 5 years. How thorough is the sealing? Asked a safety specialist who was clearly running mental calculations about containment failure probability. The design specifications called for the containers to remain sealed and safe for a minimum of 50,000 years under worst-case environmental conditions. They're probably good for considerably longer than that, but 50,000 years was the official requirement. We tested them pretty extensively. Extreme temperatures, radiation exposure, seismic activity, chemical corrosion, you name it. They're very sturdy. 50,000 years. Humanity had built waste storage designed to last 50,000 years, during a period when they were still figuring out the basics of faster-than-light travel, and had only recently stopped throwing nuclear weapons at themselves. The question that nobody wanted to ask, but which was becoming increasingly obvious, was what exactly humanity was capable of now, 200 years later, if their early storage facilities were this sophisticated. Documentation you mentioned, Jector said. The Hazardous Materials Archive. Is this information available to the Federation? Oh sure, I can request access clearance. Most of it is public record anyway. The exact contents of some sites are classified because of treaty obligations, like we can't just publish detailed specifications of banned weapon systems, but the locations and general hazard categories are all documented. I'll submit a request to have it added to the Federation database. Probably should have been done when we joined, honestly, but I guess everyone was focused on other integration priorities. Everyone had been focused on other integration priorities because humanity had presented themselves as a relatively new spacefaring species that had only recently developed stable FTL. Nobody had thought to ask whether they had been throwing hazardous materials across the galaxy for the past 2.5 centuries using experimental faster-than-light drives. The observation gallery was emptying out now as researchers scattered to deal with the implications of this discovery. Papers needed to be retracted, research needed to be reevaluated. Someone had the unenviable task of informing 3 religious movements that their sacred symbols were safety warnings. The documentary series people were probably going to need a very awkward follow-up episode. Dr. Chen was packing up their equipment with the satisfied air of someone who had completed a straightforward job. This was actually really helpful. Finding one of the old sites intact like this, with the original warning system still in place, that's valuable data. We can use this to assess how well the designs held up over time. The symbols are still clearly visible. The materials haven't degraded. The structural integrity looks good. This is basically a perfect validation of the original engineering specifications. I am glad, Jector said with a flatness that the translation matrix struggled to convey, that we could contribute to your waste management research. Oh hey, don't feel bad. This happens more than you'd think. Humans stumbled on archaeological sites back on Earth all the time, and spent years analyzing them before realizing they were looking at old garbage dumps or storage facilities. There's this famous example where researchers spent decades trying to interpret cave paintings that turned out to be practice sketches and doodles. People read way too much into things sometimes. It's a natural impulse when you encounter something you don't understand. This was probably meant to be comforting. It was not particularly comforting. Dr. Chen headed toward the exit, then paused. Oh, one more thing. If you do find any more of these sites, definitely report them to the archive system. We've got a few that went off the tracking grid over the years, lost monitoring connection or whatever, and we've been trying to locate them. There's actually a finder's fee program. The Federation might want to get in on that. Could be good supplemental funding for archaeological programs. And with that parting shot, the human left, presumably to file more reports and continue being casually devastating to everyone's sense of professional competence. Jector stood in the empty observation gallery, looking down at the tablets that had consumed 5 years and countless resources and more academic effort than most civilizations put into understanding the fundamental nature of reality. 10,000 warning labels, carefully arranged, designed to last longer than most civilizations, created by a species that had looked at their capacity for creating dangerous things and decided the most responsible approach was to throw it really far away with very clear labels. The Valorians would need time to recalculate their assumptions about human technological development. The Tektar would need to update their collective understanding of human capabilities. The Meridians would probably write some contemplative poetry about hubris and the nature of understanding. The religions would need to figure out what to do with temples built around what were essentially very elaborate hazard signs. And somewhere on Earth, In the Hazardous Materials Archive, there was apparently documentation for hundreds of these sites, scattered across explored space, waiting to be discovered by well-meaning researchers who would spend years analyzing them before a human looked at them once and said, "Oh yeah, that's ours." The galaxy, Jector reflected, had been a more comfortable place when humans were considered primitive newcomers who had only recently achieved spaceflight. This new reality, where humanity had been casually throwing hazardous materials across interstellar distances for 2.5 centuries, using experimental FTL technology, was considerably less comfortable, especially since they kept describing this period as their less advanced era, which implied some very concerning things about what they were capable of now. But that, Jector supposed, was a problem for another day. For now, there were papers to retract, religions to carefully inform, and a very awkward conversation to have with the documentary producers. And somewhere, presumably, Dr. Marcus Chen was filing reports about the successful validation of 200-year-old waste management engineering specifications, blissfully unconcerned about the academic devastation left in their wake. The tablets sat in their cases, their symbols glowing faintly in the laboratory lights, no longer mysterious artifacts from an ancient civilization, but instead exactly what they had always been, in very thorough warning labels, designed by a species that had looked at the problem of dangerous waste and solved it the same way they had spowed.